The stage from Nevada had left him at the edge of a town that seemed to exist only because someone had once decided the desert needed interrupting, a scatter of clapboard buildings baking under a sky so wide and pale it looked bleached, and he stood there in the settling dust with a leather ledger book under one arm and a satchel of tools in his other hand, and that, along with the clothes he wore, was the whole of what he owned in the world. The mine had promised silver and delivered debt instead, the kind that swallowed men whole and spat out only their names on unpaid notes, and he had walked away from it, with his accounts balanced to the penny and his pockets empty of everything else. He had thought, boarding that last coach, that a man who could make numbers behave might find welcome anywhere numbers were needed, which was, he would come to understand, a very foreign kind of hope to carry into a very particular kind of town. The boarding-house woman looked at him the way one looks at weather that might ruin a wash day, taking in the cut of his coat, the shape of his vowels when he asked, politely, for a room and a meal he could work off if credit could not be extended, and she said there was no vacancy, though the shuttered windows behind her told a different arithmetic than the one he had come west to practice. The mercantile owner would not meet his eyes at all, occupying himself with a ledger of his own, and a pair of men loading a wagon by the feed store fell silent and watched him pass with the particular stillness of men deciding, without discussion, that he did not belong among them. He understood, by the third refusal, that it was not merely the dust on his boots or the hollows beneath his eyes that turned doors against him, but something underneath his speech, the shape his mouth made around English, learned late and carefully, and something too in the small silver cross he did not wear but whose absence, in a town of a single insistent faith, seemed to announce itself regardless. A settlement built by people who had crossed their own deserts for the right to worship as they pleased, had apparently concluded that the privilege did not extend past their own fence line, and he stood now on the sun-warped boards of the stage platform, hungry, unslept, and unwelcome, running his thumb along the worn spine of the ledger as though its familiar weight were the only steady thing left to him. It was there, with the heat pressing down like a hand on the back of his neck, and the last of his resolve thinning to something he did not care to examine too closely, that a wagon rattled up the rutted street toward the platform, driven by a woman in a plain gray dress, who sat the bench like someone accustomed to carrying more than reins, and who slowed the team and looked at him for a long, measuring moment before she spoke at all. She did not climb down from the wagon at once, and that hesitation, brief as it was, told him something of her character before a single word passed between them, that she was not a woman who acted on impulse, but one who weighed a thing fully before she committed her hand to it, the way a careful bookkeeper might weigh a column before entering the sum. Her eyes moved over him with an economy that felt less like judgment and more like accounting, the scuffed boots, the satchel gone thin at the seams, the ledger held as though it were the only deed to anything he still owned. Then she set the brake and stepped down, and the elder, still standing near enough to hear, straightened his collar in a way that suggested he expected her to agree with him, to nod her confirmation of what had already been declared as settled truth. "You're the one they're all talking about," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only a plain statement of fact, the kind a rancher might make about weather. "I am the one who arrived on the coach," he answered, "though I cannot say what has been said of me beyond that." "An immigrant cannot keep books for a Christian ranch," the elder repeated, as though the sentence gained truth through repetition, and he looked to her now for the agreement he had assumed was his by right of standing. She did not give it to him. She turned instead to Friedrich, and something in her face had already decided the matter before her mouth caught up to it. "I have $900 of debt on my brother's ranch, and a set of books so tangled I can't tell what I owe from what I'm owed," she said. "I need a man who can read numbers, not a man who can recite scripture I already know by heart." The elder's mouth tightened, but she did not wait for his objection to fully form. $2 a week," she said to Friedrich directly. "Bunkhouse and meals besides. You'll have the account books sorted inside the month, or I'll know the reason why." It was not charity, and he understood that at once, the way he understood the weight of a ledger before he opened it. She was not offering him a kindness he must be grateful for, but a wage for labor she genuinely needed done, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a man reduced and a man restored. He straightened, feeling something in his chest unclench for the first time since the mine had failed and taken his last certainty with it. "I accept," he said, and held out his hand, not knowing yet whether such a gesture would be met or refused in a town that had already shown him its fences. She took it, her grip firm and dry, and entirely without hesitation, while behind them the elder turned and walked back toward the meeting house without another word, and the wagon wheels, when she gestured him up onto the bench beside her, groaned forward into the white and waiting road. The bunkhouse smelled of tallow and dried sagebrush, and the particular staleness of a room that had been built by men who did not intend to linger in it, and he set his satchel down upon the narrow bunk assigned to him with the care of a man who owned little enough that each object still mattered. There was a washstand with a chipped bowl, a window no larger than a ledger page itself, and a lamp whose wick had burned down crooked, and by its light, once the ranch had settled into the particular hush that falls over a working place at the end of day, he untied the string around the account books she had given him and opened the first to its earliest page. He had expected disorder. He had not expected the particular shape of it. The numbers in the first months ran clean enough, the hand that made them careful and even, columns of feed and shearing costs and wages paid to hands whose names he did not yet know. But somewhere past the turn of the year the entries began to waver, a sum carried forward incorrectly here, a purchase recorded twice there, small enough errors that a careless eye might read past them as the ordinary clumsiness of a tired bookkeeper. He was not a careless eye. He had spent too many years bent over books that other men's fortunes depended upon to mistake honest fatigue for something else, and as he moved deeper into the ledger, tracing sums with the stub of pencil he kept behind his ear from old habit, he began to notice how the wavering did not scatter itself evenly, but clustered, always, around the entries touching the note held against the ranch. $900, the ledger claimed, and beneath that figure a column of interest and fees that did not, when he added them by his own hand a second time and then a third, arrive at the total written beside them. He sat back on the thin mattress and looked for a long while at the crooked lamp flame, feeling the old familiar tightening of attention that used to come to him in the mine office when a shipment's weight did not match its manifest, and understood that whoever had kept these books before him, Cobb, the name signed small and slanting at the bottom of each closing page, had either been careless in a very particular and consistent direction or had not been careless at all. The note was due within the month. He turned back to the earliest pages and began again from the beginning, this time writing his own figures in a fresh notebook beside the old ones, column against column, patient as a man counting sheep through a gate in the dark, and did not yet know how much the difference between Cobb's sums and his own would come to mean before the debt came due. He worked through the night by the light of that crooked lamp, and the deeper he went into the old ledger the more his eye, trained across years of counting silver by the pound and timber by the board foot, began to snag on small things that a careless glance would have let pass. The numeral 7, for one, was written two different ways in the same hand, open and looping in the early months of the book, closed and severe in the later ones, as though the man who had kept these pages had changed the manner of his writing sometime around midwinter, or as though two different pens had shaped the same fingers into two different habits. He held the lamp closer and turned the pages slowly, comparing the slant of the ink, the pressure of the downstrokes, the way certain nines were closed at the top in some columns and left open in others, and felt the particular cold clarity that had once told him, in the mine office, that a shipment manifest had been copied twice by two different clerks pretending to be one. He found, too, that the entries which troubled him most were not scattered evenly through the book, but clustered around the columns marked interest and fees, as though whoever had gone back into these pages afterward had known precisely which figures could be touched without disturbing the ranch's own record of wool sold and stock purchased. Figures a widow keeping her own rough count in the kitchen might have noticed missing, but figures of compounding interest that no one but a bookkeeper would think to question. He set the lamp down and pressed his palms flat against his eyes for a moment, weary, and told himself that a man newly arrived in a town that already doubted him ought to be careful before he named a fraud where a simple error might serve as well. And yet the carefulness of the alteration, the very restraint of it, argued against simple error the longer he studied it. He thought of the accountant's name signed small at the bottom of each closing page, slanting always to the left as though in a hurry to be gone, and wondered what manner of man left a ranch's books in such a state, and then left the settlement itself before anyone arrived to ask him a plain question. He did not yet have proof enough to carry to anyone, least of all to a woman who had staked $2 a week and a place at her own table on the strength of his word, a suspicion built on the shape of a 7 and the clustering of a few doubtful sums would not stand before an elder already looking for reasons to send him back down the road he had come by. But he closed the old ledger gently, as a man closes a door he means to open again, and drew his own fresh notebook nearer, and began, page by page, to keep two records where before there had been only one. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated less by the clock than by the swelling bellies of the ewes, for lambing season had crept upon the ranch the way winter crept upon the desert, slow, then suddenly total, until every pen and shed seemed given over to the business of birth. He rose before the sun now, not because anyone had asked it of him, but because he had come to understand that a ranch does not keep office hours, and that the numbers he tended by lamplight meant nothing if the flock that produced them perished for want of a careful hand at the wrong moment. The hired men had watched him at first with the particular wariness reserved for a man who wrote more than he worked, who spent his afternoons hunched over figures while they hauled feed and mended fence, and none watched him more coldly than the eldest among them, a weathered man who had buried 2 wives and outlived 3 winters worse than this one, and who said little but missed nothing. He had not spoken more than a dozen words to the newcomer in as many days, and those words had carried the flat courtesy of a man reserving judgment until the evidence forced his hand. The evidence came on a morning still black at the edges, when a ewe went down hard in the birthing pen and would not rise, and the old hand, kneeling beside her with his jaw set, muttered that the lamb was turned wrong, and there was no help for it but to lose them both. It was then that the immigrant came, still buttoning his coat against the cold, and knelt without being asked, and set his hands to the work with a stillness that seemed to quiet the animal before it quieted the men watching him. He worked by feel more than sight, murmuring low words in a language none of them knew, his hands moving with the patient exactness of a man accustomed to untangling knots that other men had given up on, until at last the lamb came free, slick and gasping, and the ewe lived to lick it clean in the gray light. No one spoke for a long moment. Then the old hand, wiping his hands on his trousers, allowed only that the newcomer had a gentle way with a frightened animal, which was, from a man of so few words, very near to praise. He did not answer beyond a nod, for he had learned already that trust in this country was not given in speeches, but accumulated in small, undeniable acts, the way his own figures accumulated toward a truth still hidden beneath a stranger's careful alterations. He rose, wiped his hands, and returned to the house before full light, where two ledgers waited beneath a loose board, patient as the lambs themselves, for the moment they would be needed. The days that followed took on a rhythm as steady as breathing, and it was in that rhythm that trust began, quietly, to accumulate the way sediment settles in still water, unseen, until one day the glass ran clear. He rose before the household stirred, when the desert cold still lay flat and silver over the yard, and he walked the pens counting the newborn lambs against the numbers he kept in his head before he ever set them to paper, a private arithmetic that comforted him the way prayer might comfort another man. At the long table in the ranch house, over plates of fried pork and hard bread, he ate in the company of hands who had begun, cautiously, to pass him the salt without being asked, which he understood to be its own kind of testimony. She noticed these small exchanges without remarking on them, for she had learned that to praise a thing too loudly in this country was to invite scrutiny of it, and scrutiny, in a season of lambing and debt, was a thing she could not spare. It was during the second week that he first noticed the discrepancy that would not let him rest, a column of feed purchases that did not match the receipts he had found bundled and yellowing in a drawer, the numbers in the old ledger inflated just enough to seem plausible, just enough to escape a careless eye. He sat with the book open long after the house had gone dark, the lamp burning low, and traced the entries back through the months with the patience of a man following a thread through a maze, until he found 3 other places where the ink sat differently on the page, where a figure had been altered after the fact by a hand trying too hard to seem unhurried. He said nothing of it that night, not even to her, for he had not yet gathered proof enough to speak, and he had learned in another country what became of foreigners who accused men of standing before they could prove it. Instead, he began, without asking permission, to keep a second accounting, a duplicate, entry for entry, set down in his own small, clear hand in a fresh ledger he purchased with 2 weeks of his wages from the mercantile in town, over the clerk's raised eyebrow. Each night he transferred the day's true figures into this second book, and each night he wrapped it in oilcloth and set it into a tin box he had found rusting behind the smithy, and slid the box beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of the bunkhouse where his cot stood, tamping the board down flush so that no one, glancing in, would know a truth was sleeping there. He told himself it was only prudence, the habit of a careful man, but some quieter part of him understood he was building a wall against a flood he could feel coming, though he could not yet see its shape, somewhere out past the ridge where a rider had lately been seen asking after the ranch's accounts. The rider out past the ridge stayed a rumor for the better part of a week, the kind of thing hands mentioned over supper and then let fall, and so it was on an ordinary Tuesday, with the ranch's flour running low and the lambing pens needing new slats before the ewes grew heavy, that he was sent into town with a list written in Hannah's own hand and the ranch's account book tucked beneath his arm, as though it were a passport he might need to produce. The mercantile smelled of coffee and lamp oil and the particular dust that settled into every board of every building in that country, and the clerk behind the counter, a thin young man with a collar too tight for the heat, took the list without meeting his eyes, read it twice, and set it down as though it had grown heavier in the reading. "Accounts closed to credit," the clerk said. Elder's word. He did not raise his voice, for he had learned that a raised voice was often mistaken, in such rooms, for guilt rather than grievance. "The ranch has paid every bill it has owed since I came," he said. "There is a ledger here that shows it plain." "I don't need to see it," the clerk said, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he said it, as though he wished the rule were not his to enforce, and knew it would be enforced regardless. He was still standing there, the list in one hand and the ledger in the other, feeling the particular smallness of a man refused in a room full of goods he was not permitted to touch, when the door opened behind him and let in a bar of white daylight and, within it, her. She did not raise her voice either. She walked to the counter as though she came every Tuesday of her life, which she did, and set her palm flat upon the wood beside the list. "The account is mine," she said. "I'll stand behind whatever he purchases on it, same as I stood behind Cobb, same as I'd stand behind any hand of mine buying flour for my table." The clerk's eyes went to the ledger still in his hands, then to her, then back to the shelves behind him, as if the answer might be written there among the tinned goods. Elder said, "The elder isn't paying your wages," she said, not unkindly. "And he isn't paying my note either. I am. Fill the list." There was a silence in which the clerk seemed to weigh the distance between a rule spoken once in passing and a woman standing plainly in front of him with her name good on every book in the territory, and then he took up the list again and began, without further comment, to gather flour and coffee and nails into a crate, while outside the window the street went on in its ordinary business, indifferent to the small, quiet victory being measured out in sacks and tins. Silas Trench came to Larkspur Fold on a Thursday, riding a bay gelding too fine for a man of his trade, with a leather satchel across his lap that he handled the way other men handled Scripture, as though its contents carried a weight beyond paper. He did not dismount at once, but sat looking down at the porch, at the woman standing on it with her arms folded and her chin set, and at the immigrant who came around the corner of the house with lambing shears still in his hand, and something in the way he looked at the two of them together seemed to calculate an equation he had not expected to need solving. "I've come about the note," he said, and there was no pretense of pleasantry in it, no easing into the business as a neighbor might. He opened the satchel and produced a single sheet, close written, and held it out, not to her, but to the space between them, so that either might take it or neither. "The bank's figures show the debt has grown. Interest, penalties for late filing. It comes now to something nearer 1,100 than 9. The immigrant took the sheet before she could reach for it, and read it standing in the yard with the shears still in his other hand, and the silence he made while reading was longer than seemed natural, long enough that Trench shifted in the saddle as though the quiet itself were an accusation. When he looked up, his voice was mild, almost apologetic, the voice of a man pointing out an error in a column rather than accusing another of a crime. "This figure here," he said, touching a line near the bottom. "For late filing in November. There was no filing in November. I have the receipt from the county clerk myself, dated October the 9th. He turned the page slightly toward the light. "And this interest calculation compounds monthly, where the note specifies annual. It is the same manner of error I found in Mr. Cobb's book, in the entries from a year past. The same hand, I think, though a different name is signed to it." Trench's face did not change so much as it settled, the way water settles after a stone has gone under it, and he reached for the paper with a motion too quick to be entirely without meaning. "You'd accuse a bankman of forgery on the word of a foreigner with a ledger." "I accuse no one," the immigrant said, folding the sheet once and holding it against his chest rather than surrendering it. "I only say the numbers do not agree with the county's own record, and numbers, Mr. Trench, do not care whose hand writes them down. They only care whether they are true." Hannah had not moved from the porch, but something in her stillness had sharpened, the way a held breath sharpens before speech, and Trench, seeing it, gathered his reins and said only that the bank would be in touch before the month was out, and turned his fine horse back toward the road, leaving the two of them standing in the yard with the folded paper between them, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples of it not yet finished spreading. That night the kitchen held its lamp like a small, steady coin against the dark pressing at the windows, and she set the coffee to warm, though neither of them meant to drink much of it, and the two of them sat down at the table with the folded paper between them, the way a surgeon might set down an instrument before beginning the difficult part of the work. He brought out the tin box from beneath the loose board without ceremony, only the quiet economy of a man reaching for a tool he had long expected to need, and he laid his own pages beside Trench's claim, the way one might lay two coins side by side to see which had been shaved. "Here," he said, and his finger, blunt and ink-stained, came to rest on a column of figures. In March, the note stood at 900, less the payment your brother made in autumn before he died. This is recorded in the county office, and I have copied it myself, in my own hand, on a day when Mr. Trench was not yet in this county to see me do it." He turned another page. "Here is his claim, the same month. But the number has grown by $60, and see," he traced the ink with a care that was almost tenderness, "the 7 has been made from a 1, pressed over with a heavier hand, so that in poor light a tired eye would not catch it. But ink does not lie about its own age, Frau Larsen, only about its shape, and this ink is newer than the rest of the page around it." She leaned close, and the lamp threw her shadow long across the table, and she was quiet for a long moment, studying the altered figure as though she might, by looking hard enough, make it undo itself. "He has done this more than once," she said, not a question. "3 times that I have found so far tonight," he said. "Each time small enough that a woman grieving her brother and trusting the man her brother trusted would not think to doubt it. That is the cruelty of it. He did not steal in one great theft. He took a little, and called it interest, and interest is a word people are taught not to question." She sat back, and something that had been drawn tight in her shoulders since the yard, since Trench's horse had carried him off down the road, loosened by some small degree, though not entirely, for fear does not leave a person all at once, but goes the way frost goes from a window, in patches, admitting a little more light each time. "Then we have proof," she said. "We have the beginning of proof," he said. "Enough, I think, to make a bank uneasy. Whether it is enough to move a whole town, that we will still need to earn." Word of what had passed in the yard did not stay contained within the bunkhouse walls, for such things never do in a town small enough that every lamp lit past dark was noticed and accounted for by someone's watching window, and by the second morning it had traveled the whole distance of the settlement, the way water travels down a dry creek bed after rain, finding every low place, filling every ear willing to receive it. She had said, to no one in particular but to everyone who would carry it, that she meant to bring the matter before the note-holder plainly, with figures set beside figures, and let the truth stand where it would be seen. She had not asked permission to say this. She had simply said it, at the mercantile counter, in a voice pitched to carry no further than was proper, and yet it carried all the same. The town received this news the way a town receives any news that threatens to unsettle its arrangements, which is to say, unevenly and along lines that had less to do with the figures themselves than with what each person had already decided, long before any figures were shown them, about the sort of man who could be trusted to add and subtract honestly. Old Reuben came to stand near the corral one evening and said only that he had known Cobb to be a careless sort of man even before he left, and that carelessness in a ledger was a kind of lying even when it wore an innocent face, and this, from him, was as near to an open alliance as his nature permitted. Two of the neighboring hands, men who ran smaller flocks on the far side of the wash, sent word that they would stand as witnesses to what figures they knew, if it should come to that. But Elder Whitcomb, when the matter reached him, as it was certain to reach him, set his jaw in the manner of a man for whom a decision, once made, does not admit revision merely because new facts have arrived to trouble it. He let it be known, through the same channels that carried all such things, that whatever grievance she believed she carried against the collector's figures would be heard, if it must be heard at all, in the proper place and at the proper time, which was to say at Sunday meeting, before the whole congregation, and not before, and not elsewhere, for a settlement's business, he said, ought to be settled as a settlement settles it, in the light of the meeting-house, and not whispered over counters. She had wanted a bank made uneasy. What she had instead was a town dividing itself quietly into those willing to look at a column of numbers, and those who had already decided, long before any number was written, what sort of man was fit to write it. The meeting-house on Sunday carried the particular hush of a room accustomed to hymns and confessions rather than arithmetic, and when he rose from the bench with the tin box under his arm, its lid still bearing the faint rust print of the floorboard that had hidden it, a stillness came over the assembly that was not reverence but suspicion holding its breath. He did not raise his voice, for he had learned long ago that a man who shouts over numbers is a man who does not trust them, and so he set the ledgers upon the reading table beside the collector's own papers, side by side, the way a man lays two boards along a straight edge to show where one has warped. "Here," he said, "is the account as Mr. Trench presented it to her, and here is the account as it was kept, in duplicate, from the first week I came to Larkspur Fold." He walked them through it as he might have walked a child through a first lesson in sums, patient and exact, naming each entry by its date and its purpose, the wool sold in autumn, the feed bought against winter, the interest as it had actually accrued and not as it had been made to appear. When he came to the altered figure, the one that claimed a debt grown to $1,100 where the true sum stood at $9, he did not accuse. He only laid his finger upon the collector's page and then upon his own, and let the town's eyes do the arithmetic themselves. Trench's protest, when it came, arrived too late and too thin, a scramble of words about clerical error and honest mistake, but the numbers did not care for his tone, and neither, it seemed, did the room. Elder Whitcomb, whose jaw had not moved from its accustomed set through the whole recitation, leaned forward at last to study the two columns himself, tracing them with a finger gone suddenly uncertain, and the silence that followed was the silence of a man discovering that his certainty had been resting, all along, upon someone else's word, rather than his own eyes. "These figures," the elder said slowly, as though the sentence cost him something, "do not match." "No," Friedrich answered, "they were never meant to." Somewhere behind him a bench creaked as a body shifted its weight, and somewhere further back a woman's voice murmured to her neighbor, and the collector's face had gone the color of old tallow, and the town, which had spent a month deciding what sort of man was fit to write its numbers, found itself now obliged to look at what he had written. It was Hannah who broke the silence properly, rising from the bench where she had sat through the whole recitation with her hands folded tight in her lap, and the sound of her rising was itself a small scandal. For women did not stand to speak in that meeting-house, and outsiders were not spoken of by name in open worship, and she was about to do both at once. "I want it said plain," she began, and her voice did not shake, though the room had gone taut as a fence wire, that Friedrich Voss has saved this ranch, and saved it with nothing but patience and a careful hand, and I will not sit here and let him be thanked in silence, when silence is what this town has given him from the day he arrived. No one moved to stop her. Elder Whitcomb's mouth opened, perhaps to object, perhaps only from long habit, but nothing came of it, and he closed it again and looked instead at the ledgers still lying open on the table, as if they might yet offer him some other verdict than the one already rendered. Trench had gone, slipped out during the murmuring, and no one troubled to watch him leave. Afterward, in the plain gold light of the yard, with the meeting-house emptying slowly behind them, and the flock already drifting toward the near pasture in its unhurried way, Hannah found him standing by the gate where he had left his hat on the post that morning, turning it now in his hands, as though uncertain what to do with them otherwise. "I did not ask if you meant to stay past the harvest," she said, and there was something in the plainness of it that asked more than it said. "I never gave you a reason to think I'd go," he answered, and she nodded slowly and looked past him toward the hills where the grass had begun, at last, to green after the long, dry weeks. "I don't mean the bookkeeping," she said. "I mean the rest of it, the house, the years after this one." He was quiet long enough that a lamb bawled somewhere behind them and was answered by its mother, and then he said, simply, "Then I accept," and she reached out and took his hand, not as a woman sealing a bargain, but as one who had carried a weight alone long enough to know the relief of setting half of it down. The flock moved past them into the ordinary brightness of the morning, unhurried, unremarkable, and entirely unaware that anything at all had changed.